Will you pray for me? Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. He worked on an assembly line at the Ford plant in Detroit. He was so young. He was just 19. And every day he would come in and he would sit down and he would do his job over and over and over. He worked so hard every day, over and over and over. And it was funny. It seemed like the days stretched on forever, but it felt like he was running all day long. It was like Lucy with the assembly line and the chocolates, only it wasn't funny. All day long, over and over and over. It felt like he was running, not just to keep up with the line, not just to keep up with the guys on either side of him, but to keep up with the bills that were always chasing him down, to get away from the past that he was coming away from all day long. It took forever, and it felt like he was sprinting. And he didn't know how he would get through it if it weren't for his book. They didn't know about the book, the other guys on the line, but he kept it down here, a little sketchbook and a pencil. And all day long, whenever he got a minute, he would draw. He drew the guys next to him. He drew the bosses. He drew the view from the place where he sat. He drew incredible things right out of his brain. And it got him through the day, but still it was like he was running all day long until one day he couldn't take it anymore. And so he stood up from the line and he decided to go to work. It was a rough environment, all that dust, all that grit, the metal shavings, the fumes. He knew he was going to have to get something that could stand up to all of that. He knew he was going to have to use found objects because he didn't have anything with him. So he went and he found a couple of pallets and he broke them apart and he nailed them back together into a big square and he propped it against the wall. And he went and got some auto paint, hard enamel. And he brought it over there and he found a brush somewhere and he started to paint. And the line kept going and the other guys kept working. And he kept painting until he had all those boards, this great huge painting done. And then one of them looked up and his eyes got wide and he stopped. And that made the next guy stop, which made the next guy stop, until eventually they had all looked up and opened their eyes, and there was this painting in front of them. And then the bosses noticed, and they came running, and they saw what he had done, and they stopped. And they said, "Son, you're off the line. Would you like to be our artist in residence?" At a Ford plant. They hired him right there, and he spent his days painting in the Ford plant. And he would put these great big works of art up all over. And the men and women on the lines, from time to time, they would look up and their eyes would get big. And they would pause. And they would go back to work. And he became famous. His name is Tony Rocco, R-O-K-O. You can look him up when you get home. You might not like his art. A lot of people don't. But he exhibits it all around the country. He's gone all around the world with this art. He can pay for his life by painting now, but he still works there at the Ford plant sometimes. But he doesn't work the line anymore. Do you know about the 8th day of creation? This is the story we tell. This is how we say it goes. On the first day, when there was nothing in the world yet, God spoke and said, "Let there be light." And it was like a big bang. And everything sprang into being. And that was the first day. And then God said, "Let there be distance. Let there be sky. Let there be space that separates things." And a millennium, 2 millennia, an eon, an age of the universe passed, and that was the second day. And then God started to pull that energy that God had made, that light the first day, pull it together, and it became atoms and molecules and stuff. It became matter. God created land. God created matter on that third day. And a millennium, 2 millennia, an age of the universe passed, and that was the third day. And then there was the fourth day, and an age passed, and then there was the fifth day, and an age passed, and then there was the sixth day, and on the sixth day, all that stuff had come together, and it had evolved over eons, over millennia, over ages, and it became animals. It became us. And suddenly that matter could think in a way it had never thought before. It could make decisions in a way it had never thought before. God had blown God's own spirit into it on that sixth day, and God looked down and said, "It is good." And then on the seventh day of creation, God rested and said, "It is good." Do you know about the eighth day of creation? God said it was good, but God looked down, and it looked to God like everybody was running all the time. The predators were hungry, and they were running after their prey, and the prey wanted to survive, and so they were running away from the predators. And the humans were running after the prey, and they were running to scratch food out of the ground, and they were running from their own deaths all day long. And some of them were running from spouses. And some of them were running from armies. The armies would come sweeping through, and the people would run, and the soldiers were running after them, and the bosses of the soldiers were running after them, and the kings and the emperors, they were running from themselves. And it seemed to God that everybody was running all day long from the cradle to the grave. And they couldn't stop. So God went and sat down with that great line of humanity and started running with them. But what they didn't know was that God was making a plan. And when God's plan was ripe, when the moment was just right, God stood up from the line and looked around. God knew it was a rough environment. There was a lot of dust and metal shavings and fumes around. God was going to have to do something that would stand up for a long time. God knew God was going to have to use found materials. And so gathered a couple of pieces of wood and a few nails and a crown of thorns and a big boulder. God stood up and went to work. They had been running so much lately. They ran out of the garden and away from the soldiers on Thursday. They ran out of the courtyard on Friday. They ran to the cross and saw him die. They ran as they carried his body to the tomb. On Sunday, they came to the garden and saw it was empty, and she ran and got the others, and they ran back, and then they ran again. And Mary, there she stood in the garden running and running and running in circles until he said, "Mary." And then she stopped and looked up, and her eyes got big. And that was the eighth day of creation. They call Easter the eighth day of creation, when God perfected what God had done. When God saw all that God had made, and it was good, but God saw some flaws, and God came down and fixed it forever. When God saw all the people running so hard all day long and said, "You can stop now. It will be okay. What you're running from will not catch you in the end." They call it the eighth day of creation. The day that God stood up and went to work, and the people looked up and opened their eyes and realized they didn't have to run on the line anymore. Say amen.